Hello, how are you? Oh, you're still muted.
There we go. Hi. Hello. I'm excited for this. Nervous.
Oh. Okay. I have the YouTube live link on, and it definitely took a second for it to think. And okay, I'm gonna mute that thing. Okay.
Good morning. G'day.
Hello. How is the dead of night treating you over there?
It's pretty good. I got my coffee. It's all good.
I was going to ask, is this very late or very early for you?
It's depending on many factors. It's turning to 3 a.m. I got a couple of hours sleep in, so I'm doing all right. I'm excited. It's gonna be fun.
Yeah, thanks again for doing this. Waking up, staying up.
Well, when I first signed up to do this, I didn't realize the time difference, but
yeah, it didn't occur to me when I asked. I was like, oh, yeah, he seems like the perfect candidate for I didn't think about the solidly, 17-hour difference?
yeah, it always surprises me. It always it's what kind of sucks about being in Australia is all the good philosophy workshops, online conferences during COVID have been at 3 a.m. in the morning.
Hi there, I'm Laura. Hi, Cassie. We finally meet. It's funny that my last job was with Berlitz, the language company, and their development team was in Sydney. So our meetings were, let's say, rather strange. They were at strange hours, either very late at night or very, very early in the morning.
I've got friends who work in what they deem as international finance, and they have odd working hours. Basically, yeah, they're all night owls and sleep during the day because that's when the US stock market's open. So it's pretty amazing. It's not too bad. The worst thing about this is my family scheduled a get together for today, Sunday, which is perfectly normal, except I will be zombie like after this conference, and they'll blame me somehow.
Red Bull and courage, that's what it takes.
Yeah, I'll get through it. But there's no better time to talk about philosophy and ethics and accountability than at 3 a.m.
That sounds right.
Oh, Cassie, can I ask you a quick question?
Yeah, what's up?
Will I be allowed to share my screen?
Good.
I have some slides. Is that okay?
Oh, yes. That's so exciting. Yes, of course. I'm just going to make you co-host because I think that's the most straightforward way.
I've practiced doing it, so hopefully it just works smoothly. So.
Okay. I have like 3 screens on at once trying to make sure I'm on the same page with Jen and everything. So, like, I hear noise. I heard someone. Is it from you? No. Okay. We're good. All right. Do you see you should be able to share screen now?
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I'll do that in a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
I also hope everyone can hear me properly because there are people sleeping in the house, so I'm trying to be quiet.
Nah, you good? We can hear you all right. So just logistically, you have about 25 minutes or so for your presentation. I can, if you want to keep your own time, you can. Otherwise, I can send you, a private message when you have a couple minutes left to let you know.
Okay, I think when I timed it, I was a little under 25, so we should be okay. But if I get rambly and we get close, then
okay.
Let me know.
Sounds good. And then William, you have 10 minutes or so. And then Rachel, you have 5-ish. And then we'll open it up for questions. And for questions, you can raise your hand, you can type them in the chat. We can go from there. Ideally, just not randomly jumping in, having some sort of cue either through the participants. I guess it's through reactions now. Reactions, raise hands, or typing in the chat to everybody. If you don't want your question to be public, you can send it privately to me and I can anonymize and ask it on your behalf. Although we're all friends here.
I was gonna say, I hope there's nothing that spicy in my presentation.
I don't know. I think crowdfunding really gets people's goat.
Yeah, like we'll see. I'm excited. This is going to be the first time I present anything kind of like related to my thesis since my defense. So yeah, I will say actually from the outset, because I think there's some things that William will mention in his commentary that I talk about in other sections of my thesis. So if you have, I'm going to just say I'm also open to feedback about things that would kind of enhance your understanding and enjoyment of the presentation overall. Because yeah, I'm excited to be hopefully doing a few things with this over the next couple of months.
I mean, that's good because my prepared comments are quite short. I don't think I'll take the 10 minutes. But one of the goals I had was I noticed that you said it was a master's thesis. And I'm like, well, let's give Rachel a chance to talk about her thesis a bit more, because there's nothing more that academics love than talking about their finished products.
Every time I open the chapter drafts now, though, I find a typo or an error somewhere where I left an extra letter in. So
it's all good.
Never having to see it again, then that's the dream.
A good friend of mine misspelled philosophy on his final submission for his doctoral thesis. It came back all nice and shiny, and on the front page, misspelled philosophy. So it's a common occurrence. Lots of typos and bad grammar in doctoral theses and master's theses.
It's reassuring to hear that in some respects.
All right, we'll give folks another minute or so. Also, so this is going to go for roughly an hour, and then we have an hour break before we do the workshops. And during that hour, the Zoom room A, so that's Jen's room, Zoom room A is just going to be kind of open for people to pop in and talk to each other and introduce each other and keep talking and socializing and such. So just putting that out there. There kind of is stuff happening during the breaks, but as you need to go and do lunch or whatever. So.
Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Cool. Are you just seeing the slide, or are you seeing a bunch of behind the scenes features as well?
The slide.
Just the slide.
Okay. All right. So first up, we have Rachel Katz. They got their master's from McMaster University, and they are currently an RA at Western University. So take it away, Rachel.
Cool. Okay. So, hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. So before I get started, I just want to quickly acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation on the traditional land of the Seneca, Huron-Wendat, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land, and I understand and recognize the enduring presence and stewardship of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples on this land. Okay, so today I want to talk a bit about funding. Picture this. You're a young academic who's just found out that your grant proposal has not been chosen for the current funding cycle. Instead of resigning yourself to the arduous paperwork of reapplying next time, you set up an account on a crowdfunding platform, and within 2 weeks of submitting your proposal to the site, you have approval to collect funds and can start raising money. It sounds great, right? Almost too good to be true. It is, at least right now. I spent the last year and change investigating some of the ethical issues associated with crowdfunding, very specifically crowdfunding sites for academic research. So in this presentation, I'm going to do a few things. First, I'm going to give a quick little primer on crowdfunding in academic research and contextualize this trend sort of within the open science movement of the 20th century. I may also hint a bit at some of the other history of science stuff that is relevant in my thesis, but I've left that portion for the most part out of this discussion. And so then I'm going to get into two of the key ethical issues I see arising with the growth of these platforms, namely trust and transparency. And after that, I'll kind of conclude with some suggestions for how crowdfunding platforms can operate more ethically. Before I dive in, though, a few quick little points and disclaimers. So the first is that there's very little literature on this subject, and almost nothing currently exists in terms of philosophical discussion about the ethical use and regulation of these platforms. Part of what I try to do in this presentation is kind of get the pot kind of stirring a little bit, but I think we're probably a ways away from having any kind of concrete solutions. I also, just kind of almost like a grammatical point, I use experiment to refer to experiment.com, which is one of the bigger research crowdfunding sites. It's not the only one, and like actually another crowdfunding platform called Science Booster just followed me on Twitter the other day. But because of experiment size relative to other platforms, I focused my analysis on their conduct and policies in my research. So let's talk about experiment a little bit. Like entrepreneurial crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter, or those more focused on emergency aid and fundraising like GoFundMe, technically anyone can launch or support a campaign. There's an approval process, so not every submitted proposal gets the go-ahead for fundraising, but the site has about a 47% success rate for those proposals that are selected. Once a proposal is approved, people can then start to contribute to the crowdfunding campaign. Experiment has some tips listed, and the limited literature on the subject also provides some recommendations for involving researchers' professional and personal social networks in the crowdfunding process. And so currently, crowdfunding accounts for just a fraction of the total funded research in academia, broadly speaking. But if it continues to grow, and I think it will, I think it has the potential to upend how research is funded, how the public is involved in funding decision-making, and the course of research development in a number of fields. But I'd argue that this isn't the first time the world has seen this kind of shift in how research is done. I think some of the changes brought on by crowdfunding can be compared to the formation of the Royal Society and Francis Bacon's influence on that, and even more recently, the open science movement of the 20th century. I think much of the ethos of open science is captured by sociologist of science Robert K. Merton's 4 norms for conducting scientific research, often shortened to KUDOS, for communism, universalism, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. And I've got a brief description of each of those terms on the slide. These norms have, consciously or not, shaped much of the modern open science movement, which promotes an approach to research where data, code, methods, and materials may be shared with other researchers, and there's an emphasis on publishing in open access journals. So I want to ground some of my ethical analysis in norms like Merton's, particularly communism and organized skepticism, and I'll call back to these ideas as we head into the ethical issues present in crowdfunding. And so having said that, I now kind of want to switch gears a bit and move into analyzing trust and accountability, and later on transparency, as pressing ethical issues in the research crowdfunding scene. So accountability is of vital importance in the maintenance of a positive relationship between researchers and the general public. A buzzword used in a whole bunch of sectors, the term has come to denote a recognition on the part of a party in a position of power that they owe a certain conduct and honesty to their constituents or clientele, depending on the setting, whether they're publication readers, like tattoo shop patrons, or municipal governments. The ubiquity of the terms accountable and accountability in 2020 and 2021 is really interesting and not one I really get into here, but I think any discussion of accountability to the general public would be incomplete without recognizing the seeming frequency with which it gets used now. Because the way the public perceives a term is important in this context, as it reframes what the public expects of people in positions of power. And this, of course, extends to the collection and use of funds for conducting research projects. In order to accommodate the expanding use of this term, I want to be flexible but clear in my understanding and use of accountability. So this is why I like political science professor Melvin J. Dubnick's definition. He describes accountability as a means to steer behavior based on answerability to a higher authority, a definition that I think holds true both in traditionally funded and crowd-funded research. More traditional funding agencies. So in Canada, we have something we call the Tri-Council. There's a group for social science and humanities, one for science and engineering, and one for health research. These groups that I call the Tri-Council for short, can use their application system to decide where to best allocate taxpayers' money. Researchers who receive funding through this avenue are accountable to the agency that funds their research. They have to comply with Tri-Council guidelines, and they're bound by a commitment to use funds appropriately, embody academic rigor and integrity in their work, and acknowledge any conflicts of interest. While these researchers aren't in direct contact with the public, the expectations laid out in the Tri-Council's framework for responsible research exist in part to ensure that public funding is used appropriately. And this infrastructure doesn't really exist in non-traditional funding avenues, including crowdfunding. So since there's no mechanism or structure for accountability built into that crowdfunding model, the burden falls on researchers to initiate accountability through a different avenue, trust. And so then the question becomes, well, how do we build trust? To examine trust in this context, I wish to adopt Margaret Gilbert's description of a type of reciprocal relationship she calls joint commitment. And I'm going to look pretty specifically at her account in her 2018 book, though I know she has talked about it in other works. So Gilbert advances an account of joint commitment as separate from individual commitments. She defines joint commitment as one where multiple parties consciously and jointly enter into a specific state as a result of an agreement process. Unlike individual or personal commitments, Gilbert argues that joint commitments are a collaborative endeavor. Two or more parties co-create the commitment together, and no individual is independently responsible for any given aspect of it. They're responsible for a set of action or a single action occurring. And so this extends to the rescinding of a joint commitment as well. One person can't just pull out without any consequence. So a joint commitment represents a collaborative intent to perform a particular action or achieve a particular goal as a united body. All involved parties have to express a readiness to undertake such a commitment together. And Gilbert argues that this isn't limited to a single form. Parties can enter a joint commitment through a question and affirmative response, or an open call for responses, and other scenarios that culminate in multiple parties affirming an intent to carry out a particular action broadly construed. I'm very sorry, I think that is my Discord going off and I cannot change it right now. Gilbert argues that parties have the grounds to make demands of one another in order to maintain the status of a joint commitment, and centers accountability as a key component of these commitments. Every party must be held accountable to every other party involved in a joint commitment. And so the interactions between experiment, researchers seeking financial support, and donors to crowdfunding campaigns are all parties involved in a joint commitment where the product of that commitment is the development or publishing of new research. And I see this as aligning with Mertonian communism, which describes scientific findings as the products of social collaboration and assigned to the community. While the community in question is now a lot broader than when Merton was writing, this description still captures the spirit of both Merton's goals and those of crowdfunding platforms. So when our professor, let's call her Professor Joe, approaches experiment with her research idea, she's implicitly asking, do you trust me and the research I hope to produce? So then we've initiated this tripartite joint commitment, which is composed of 3 components. We have Professor Doe, who's confirmed a particular research question or study with specific budgetary requirements in mind. And then experiment has approved that proposal, and donors contribute to that campaign based on the information contained within it. I hope you all like my very artistic representation here. Each party here is accountable to every other party, and there's no way for their agreement to survive without the ongoing assent and participation of Professor Doe, experiment, and the donors who support her through her experiment funding page. Trust is a vital connection made between every party involved, and it has to be understood as such. So to kind of get into this a little bit further, Honora O'Neill has written on the connection between trust and accountability on several occasions over the past decades. So I'm going to focus in particular on a 2018 paper and a 2020 paper. In the 2018 paper on trust versus trustworthiness, O'Neill explains that trust can be a really valuable tool when placed in people, groups, or institutions worthy of that trust, but that it can also be damaging to trusting individuals if their trust is misplaced and put instead in untrustworthy groups. But how do we determine that? O'Neill is especially troubled by the eroding of traditional gatekeepers by the digital landscape, where it may be more difficult for individuals to discern whether their trust is well or misplaced. And she kind of continues this thread in a 2020 paper on digital media trust and accountability, where she explores the nuances and changes in trustworthiness, accountability, and how we end up placing trust in the 21st century. O'Neill argues that as media and journals increasingly move online and the once clearly defined roles of editors, writers, and publishers follow suit, what she calls the old intermediaries, especially the printed word, are no longer as relevant as they once were. This means that consumers, from crowdfunding contributors to bakers looking for a new cookie recipe, may have more difficult time discerning honest claims from fraudulent ones, and this has made the act of placing trust in people and institutions more complicated. So the traditional intermediaries many are taught to look for when making decisions regarding trust aren't necessarily present in digital contexts. The legal and regulatory standards of old intermediaries may not be as rigorous online. New intermediaries have sort of replaced the old, including bloggers and social media influencers, but these kind of new age experts, their authority doesn't have the same formal credentials as those old intermediaries. Digital platforms allow content creators to maintain a degree of anonymity in their posting, which is not always kind of taken up, but many do. This, combined with the various ways that content can be presented or promoted to an audience, can obfuscate the trustworthiness of that content. O'Neill then kind of asks how online communication can be held accountable to their audience, and how trustworthiness and accountability can be fostered in the digital age. While O'Neill suggests the possibility of new regulatory frameworks for digital content, she comes to the conclusion that in the case of digital content, this is going to be very difficult and possibly impossible to accomplish. The general advice in the literature for researchers aiming to use a site like Experiment is to make use of personal networks such as friends and family when fundraising, presumably because there's already this trusting relationship that was built outside the context of a financial transaction. And so this one study by a group of social scientists reinforced the importance of trust in crowdfunding in their kind of guide for scientists who are planning to use crowdfunding. And they recommend that researchers develop this core set of supporters whose early support will convey to other potential donors that the researchers in question can be trusted, which is pretty similar to what happens during more entrepreneurial startup funding procedures. These researchers also stress that precision in describing the use of funds will also help demonstrate trustworthiness. And I think these are both good, valid pieces of advice to give researchers, but I also want to counter with the argument that with decent writing skills, it's certainly possible to fool less research savvy donors into supporting a less trustworthy project. Precise wording alone is insufficient for the creation of a trusting relationship, especially a financial one between strangers facilitated by the internet. So What's a researcher supposed to do? There are complications in building a trustworthy campaign, an online persona as a researcher, and many considerations of what is an attractive project that governing bodies and donors will feel that they can trust. How can crowdfunding platforms facilitate an environment in which donors can hold researchers accountable to their research goals and use of funding? I think the answer to this may lie in greater transparency, but as I'm about to show, that's also a problem for these platforms. So most crowdfunding platforms, whether for research, product innovation, or urgent charitable action, give users the option to post updates about their campaign even after a project has successfully met its goal. And Experiment is no different on this front. The platform encourages researchers to post consistent lab notes as a way to entice people to donate during the funding campaign and to keep donors updated on any progress or stumbling blocks they encounter after they've secured funding. And I should note quickly that unlike platforms like Kickstarter, Experiment doesn't allow for any perks. You don't get a t-shirt or a magnet or anything for having contributed to a campaign. So Experiment's guide for researchers suggests 1 to 2 lab notes per week during the funding process, with a reduction to about once a week once funding has been secured. Experiment asks for 1 to 3 project updates on a project page's lab notes to keep contributors updated on how funding is being used. But according to a representative from the platform, there's currently no method in place to follow up with researchers or ensure that these notes are posted. The goal of these updates is seemingly to create a mechanism of accountability, or as O'Neill puts it, to create a new intermediary to ensure that information is being distributed by researchers on their page. But the result is this unregulated framework that isn't currently implemented evenly across the platform, and a shortcoming of the crowdfunding model that jeopardizes the trust necessary to facilitate that joint commitment between Experiment, donors, and researchers. So presumably, and this is where I make a bit of an assumption, there are 2 kinds of researchers who use platforms like Experiment. So they either fall into the A camp, where they're researchers who are inherently excited about the use of crowdfunding to support their research, or they're in camp B, where they're somewhat reluctant to use crowdfunding, but eager to secure financial support. So I'm assuming that an insignificant number of researchers who use crowdfunding sites are openly hostile to the idea of open access research and crowdfunding, given that there are enough skills and tasks associated with crowdfunding that if a researcher didn't fall into the A camp or the B camp, the work would just be kind of impossible to achieve. So despite Experiment's encouragement that researchers update their audience at least once a week, researchers squarely in that B camp may be less enthusiastic about the prospect of writing lab notes. So if we go back to our emoji professor, Professor Doe, if she's in that B camp and among those researchers who are less enthusiastic about the use of crowdfunding, what would encourage her to take some of her time each week writing an update to her project, an update about her project for her supporters? Donations through Experiment are non-refundable, which means that they can't be returned once payment has been processed. So this means that if a researcher's project is successfully funded, the status of their funding isn't contingent on their continued interaction with their donors. While Gilbert's theory of joint commitment can be used to demonstrate the ideal form of the relationship between crowdfunding platforms, researchers, and the public, the reality doesn't always necessarily replicate this ideal, and that's definitely a problem. And a scan of funded projects on Experiment illustrates this, notably because there's tremendous variety in the number of lab notes published by each project's research team. And I've included a couple of updates on the slide. I hope it's not too blurry, but basically the one on the left only has 1 lab note and is fully funded. It's actually 105% funded. The middle one has 14 lab notes and is 100% funded. And the one on the right is 110% funded, and it actually has 0 lab notes. And some projects receive thousands of dollars and have raised over 100% of their funding goal with very few or no lab notes. And so then there are others that more closely align with the suggestion made by Experiment, and they have, you know, a handful or dozens of lab notes updating donors. So although the site recommends a certain course of action for researchers, suggestion isn't really the same as mandate in a practical sense, nor are lab notes a necessary component of the joint commitment made between researchers, donors, and Experiment. And so in order to enforce greater transparency for researchers, Experiment has to build the upkeep of lab notes into their demands when they create that joint commitment with researchers. Then, if researchers fail to make good on that commitment and update supporters via lab notes, both donors and Experiment are in the position to demand that those updates occur in accordance with Gilbert's model. A more explicit breakdown of the types of projects that get funded, along with measures put in place to ensure that researchers can be held fully accountable for the use of money they raise and the research goals they have in mind, is necessary, I think. But there's currently some ambiguity on this front. Experiment allows for projects to be funded beyond 100% of a funding goal. And in the event that this occurs, Experiment allows teams to add stretch goals, which are a common tool used on many crowdfunding platforms to allow those seeking money to raise more money than the safe amount agreed upon at the beginning of a crowdfunding campaign. So in this context, if you raise over 100% of your goal, you get to keep that 100% and then anything raised beyond that. Researchers are obliged to include a budget breakdown of their project when they launch a campaign, but this only pertains to the initial funding goal. And you can see that in the slide. The funding goal for this project was $2,000. They raised $2,637. And if you look at the budget breakdown, only $2,000 are accounted for. So researchers whose campaigns surpass those funding goals don't have to publicly account for the extra money they receive. And without adequate transparency measures in place, there's no way for researchers to demonstrate to members of the public who contributed to their campaign where that money goes. While one can make the argument that once funding has been received, it's the researcher's money to use, any major change in budget and project focus would violate that standing joint commitment between researchers and contributors, researchers and Experiment, and contributors and Experiment. If Experiment hasn't facilitated a way for researchers to account for budgetary changes or stretch goals in their budget, their system is neither transparent nor able to accommodate accountability. Thus, they haven't fulfilled their component of the joint commitment and could lose the trust of donors, who may use the fact that a project has been vetted by the platform staff as a sign that a given project is trustworthy. As O'Neill has argued, traditional, and so in this case, academic intermediaries, are no longer as relevant in this context, and their digital replacements are harder to grasp, and they can't be as disciplined or held accountable in the same way. As the party with the most organizational power in this relationship, Experiment has to facilitate a shift in accountability and transparency within itself. Experiment is currently in a state where taking the initiative to become a more transparent and trustworthy platform can transform it into a powerful tool for funding and endorsing future projects from younger researchers in particular, but I don't really think it's there yet. So to wrap this up, I want to reassert that I'm not against the use of crowdfunding for research. I think it's an incredibly promising platform that can represent real change for grad students and junior faculty in particular. But there are some glaring ethical issues and burdens placed on researchers that shouldn't be ignored. And I think a lot of these issues can be resolved through more transparent functioning of these sites. And I hope the ethics literature on this subject continues to grow with this new funding avenue. So thank you very much. And I am happy to move into the commentary and question period. I'm going to stop sharing my slide now so I can turn off those notifications.
I guess I'll jump straight in. Thanks, Rachel, for a really brilliant paper. I'm really excited about this research. I think it's really cool. I think there's so much potential for expanding it in so many different directions. Before I get into my comments, I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country and pay respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which my house sits. I pay respect to their elders, past, present, and future. I recognize their continuing connection to the land and waters which have never been ceded and which hold the oldest continuing culture on the planet. Secondly, I would like to thank Cassie and Jennifer for organizing this workshop. I think this is a wonderful initiative in a really tough time for a lot of people, especially where travel and conferences are all shut down. And it gives some of us younger folk a chance to really engage in research again and in this sort of collaborative process. I'm just going to read my comments. I've sent these to Rachel already. So they're very short, and I might add to them if I have time in questions, but we'll see. In her exacting paper, Katz holds great hope for the future of crowdfunding, particularly for scientific research. In showcasing how crowdfunding follows in the model of governing norms developed by Robert Merton, she suggests that the growing in showcasing how crowdfunding follows in the model of governing norms developed by Robert Merton, Katz suggests that the growing crowdfunding movement continues to progress the open science movement that began in the 20th century. However, models lack proper mechanisms for ensuring norms of trust, accountability, and transparency between participants, funders, and mediators. As Katz states in those uncertain terms, these ethical issues are important if crowdfunding is to remain a viable option for researchers looking to fund projects. There exists a necessity for new funding platforms, donors, and researchers to reach agreement on how best to develop policies of trust, transparency, and accountability. And turning to the work of Honora Neal and Margaret Gilbert, Katz sets about to develop a framework for understanding how these ethical norms can be integrated into an already existing policy structure, such that they do not undermine the central norms governing scientific research. Now, please, if you have any problems with that summary, let me know when you have a chance to reply. But I want to pose 3 questions, which I hope will assist in clarifying some of the relational issues I see in the paper and in the project as a whole. So 2 of these I think are quite small, and the one's a much larger issue that we probably can't work out in 10 minutes. But I want to press Katz on the relationship that develops between the notion of accountability and the idea of joint commitment that she takes from Margaret Gilbert. So I think as Rachel rightly points out, each party is accountable to every other party, and there is no way for their agreement to survive without ongoing assent and participation. That's sort of what I take to be Gilbert's main thrust of joint commitment. However, in Dubnik's conception of accountability, the reference to a higher authority seems to rest uneasily with Gilbert's assertion. As I see it in these funding models, the platform and the donors hold asymmetrical power over the researcher. One assumes that the researcher is only in a position of asking for donations towards their scholarship because they have failed to achieve adequate funding through traditional means. And this suggests that perhaps the examples in the paper are a little bit misaligned. And while it is true that assent requires the participation of the researcher, it is the platform and the donor who hold ultimate power over their ability to engage actively in joint commitment. So I guess the question is, can Rachel clarify the asymmetrical relation of accountability and how it relates, I think, more to the favorable about joint commitment? I really like this idea of joint commitment, but I'm unsure of how accountability or how Dubnik's idea fits here. Secondly, Katz's account of a transparency, I think, is supremely important to any research funding, whether it takes place in traditional modes of brick and mortar universities or through the new digital marketplace of crowdfunding. Though I note once again the asymmetrical position researchers are put into through the transparency policy that I think would develop out of what Katz is saying. So Katz has spoken in a paper that, to quote, in order to enforce greater transparency from researchers, Experiment or other crowdfunding models must build the upkeep of lab moats into the demands of researchers when making a joint commitment. Then, if researchers fail to update their supporters via lab notes, both donors and experiment are in a position to demand that those updates occur in accordance with Gilbert's model. While transparency in research and scientific production is really important, my worry is that research once again put into an asymmetrical power relation with the platform and the donors, which undermines their ability to engage in the research paradigm. And while I agree with Katz that it is up to the platform to integrate policy procedure that facilitates a shift towards accountability, transparency, and trustworthiness for researchers, my concern is that there is an undue pressure placed on the researcher to conform to decisions of the platform and donors, which may undermine the Miltonian norms of communism and disinterestedness. So those are the, I guess, two small points. And the last one is just a real, I guess, general issue about where crowdfunding sits in terms of, I guess the economic mode of production we find ourselves in. So a central concern for me is that while crowdfunding alludes to a form of participatory democratic procedure in which worthy scientific projects are essentially voted on by the people, there are strong monetary incentives for platforms itself to prefer certain projects over others to improve their own bottom line. Ethical issues such as trust, accountability, and transparency must take into consideration the very fact crowdfunding projects are digital economic markets that are explicitly capitalist in intent. As is well known, capitalism is an adaptive ideological structure. New technologies, modes of exploitation, and markets emerge to create new ways for capital accumulation to continue. The tripartite relationship between the researcher, donor, and the platform exists necessarily within this ideological, political, and economic structure, whose very existence seems to be premeditated on the exploitation of the two most vulnerable groups in that relationship, the researcher and the donor. In brief, the concern amounts to whether traditional accounts of trust and accountability, such as put forward by O'Neill, only solidify those exploitive practices in these new digital marketplaces. So while sympathetic to the idea that such new platforms are in need of ethical procedures which demonstrate active consideration of trust, accountability, and transparency, I'm skeptical that such platforms, as Katz puts it at the end of her paper, upset academia's existing norms for funding research, given that the very structures that undermine and perpetuate an elitist mindset in the funding of research at brick and mortar universities are still essentially the same in these digital platforms. So just some easy comments to begin with.
I feel like I'm very excited for the third one. So I'm going to address the first two. So the first comment about joint commitment versus accountability, the way I see the kind of relationship that kind of unfolds when you create that joint commitment is not necessarily one where all of the components of that joint commitment are like identical in weight. So I think in the book, she gives an example of, Jack and Jill going up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Presumably they're both, equally able to do so. But if Jack has a broken leg and he still enters into that agreement with Jill, they've still entered into that joint agreement. It's likely going to be a little bit harder for Jack to get up the hill with, crutches and a big cast on. But despite that kind of difference in burden, they're not in a less valid joint commitment. I don't know, does that sort of answer your point on that front, or have I
I think it does. My concern is that there's in both the comments, and maybe you can just speak to the other one first, because I think they're both related, but there's just there seems to be a situation, and this is why I speak to disinterestedness in that Mertonian norm, which is like the researcher seems to be sort of put into a position where they're going to undermine their own ideas of their research in order to fund their research, and perhaps like only aim to do research which is going to get the most money to be successful in the funding outcomes, you could say, right? And I think that might, and that's how I see it, as in what I put it as asymmetrical power norms or power relations, in which there's this undue pressure on the researcher to do research which will, and this is a problem not just of crowdfunding, but also of brick and mortar universities, right? And competitive grant funding. You do research which you think will succeed, not what you're actually interested in or which will be of benefit to society.
Yeah, okay, so then I can kind of like get into the my response to your second comment, which talks a bit about some of the other work in my thesis, which I can kind of expand on now. Because yes, and there are a lot of unequal burdens placed on, I think, in researchers in particular, especially because a lot of people see crowdfunding as this really great tool for younger researchers. They're like, oh yeah, you didn't get the grant, going up against, I don't know, like several tenured professors who have names in the field. Why don't you try this other avenue? But that requires so much work, right? Like you have to put together like a video presentation, potentially. You have to know how to distill, because it's often for, I say academia broadly speaking, most of the research being funded on experiment is in the sciences. So you've got to figure out how to, and from what I know from like most of the science students that I know, is that writing is not always an emphasis in those undergrad programs in particular, which means that in grad school, you perhaps don't have the same kind of science communication skills. And so you kind of have to develop all of these new skills to adapt and make your funding enticing in a whole other way. So I agree with your comment that there are these really uneven burdens. And to tie that then to Robert Merton's norms, is I like the idea of using the kudos model kind of as this like guidepost. It kind of is there to sort of help us as this model develops. And that kind of inevitably involves some moving away from that post a little bit, so that we can kind of figure out what is not working as well, and then kind of get back a little bit more. So I don't know what the solution is right now for all of those extra burdens that are placed on younger researchers in lower income countries, because there are a whole like host of very practical issues with using sites like Experiment for crowdfunding in LMICs. But I think part of what I was hoping to do with this was that no one's really talking about that. People like to say, oh, what a great idea. Like, I'm really happy that like younger researchers or researchers in less affluent regions can like use this model. But can they? Currently, not really. Although, to then jump to like the end of your comments, because you mentioned the kind of the elitist, the maintenance of kind of elitist ideas of universities. One of the things that is kind of cool about Experiment is that they're so when you launch a project, you cite your affiliation, whether it's with like a natural history, like, I don't know, citizen group or a university. And this certainly ties into discussions of who gets funding, what university kind of brand name is attractive for kind of external grants and things like that. But there are a lot of like very small kind of like state schools or universities I'd never heard of before, where their grad students are kind of getting the chance to kind of crowdfund this unconventional or kind of really exciting research. And I was kind of expecting to see mostly like Ivy League students on these sites who are like, oh, I'd love to like, you know, fundraise an extra like $500 for, I don't know, a new lens for a microscope or something like that. And it's not necessarily that. But, and then to then go to your third comment, I'm sorry, that's a bit all over the place, but I'm realizing as I'm talking that some of these things are tied together. Yeah, one of the big things that troubles me about Experiment, one of the things that I don't think is as easily resolvable, is that Experiment does take an 8% platform fee. And for me, that is always going to be a problem. I asked, I had the chance to like talk to someone who works for the site when I was writing this thesis, and she basically said, she's like, you know, we're scientists, and they are, like most of the people who work for the site, they have a PhD in a science field. They are presumably enthusiastic about the furthering of science themselves. So they're scientists, they're not business people. At the end of the day, what they want to do is fund good science. And I sort of buy that, but I think as a philosopher, that's a really weak claim, especially because like 8% isn't nothing. And so I think that that is definitely a problem in the sense that it's a very hard thing to resolve, especially because as a business, Experiment has its own kind of priority to make money. Does that sort of answer your comments on?
Yeah, look, I think the last one is just thrown in there as like, hey, we have to remember that we live in a shitty mode of production. If to steal Altazer's term of the, sorry, I'm a continental philosopher, so I have to throw in some French people every now and then. So have you heard of there's a new crowdfunding thing. I don't think it's actually started yet, but it's Comradely, which is it's activist based. And it's anyone who joins the site. I don't know the exact mechanisms, but I guess anyone who passes the muster to fund whatever they're doing, and this might be activist stuff or art stuff or research, then becomes a part owner of Comradely, and the funding is distributed across all projects that are accepted into this. It might just be something to look at in terms of that last question, because yeah, once again, 8% is not nothing, and I feel like there's always these, as you were saying, like, oh, we're scientists first. Well, if you were scientists first, why is there an 8%? Okay, there's administrative costs. We understand this, but 8% seems a bit over what administrative costs would be for something like this.
If you want to know how they describe themselves on their website, they are, oh gosh, what is, they have this phrase, and it always makes me laugh. They call themselves, they're like a people-driven, I'm sorry, I'm looking it up on the, here we go, okay. So in their FAQ, they ask, they're like, whatever, they answer the question, is Experiment a nonprofit or for-profit organization? And they just describe themselves as a mission-driven for-profit company, which is the most baffle-gab answer I could possibly have imagined for that. So I'd like to know, like, kind of like a co-op sort of like platform. That makes a lot of sense. I'll have to look into it. And thank you for telling me about this, because I'm curious to see how it potentially kind of upsets the crowdfunding landscape.
So I think there's a couple coming up that are like this. I haven't looked into it too quickly, and I think Comrade Lee's definitely, so they're very anti-capitalist, it seems, from what I've looked at. They will not fund stuff that has anything to do with police brutality or state politics or anything like that. Anything that seems to be in support of the state or current structures of oppression, they're like, no. At the same time, it's a very communal thing of like, you become part of Comrade Lee. You're not just a researcher who we can turn the tap off with, I think going back to sort of the issues which I brought up in my second comment of like, so I think this idea of open science, and we should open it up for other people to ask questions, but this idea of open science is really, really cool. I like Mertone. I like the use of Mertone in your work. The worry is that maybe you're putting too much emphasis on, and it might be just the way, we philosophers like to idealize things a bit, but maybe there's too much emphasis on, maybe you're reading too much into the way crowdfunding's working at the moment for the Mertonian sort of norms to really come out, right? So like, it's questionable whether, as Merton puts it, like communism or disinterestedness. And I think disinterestedness is really important here, rather than maybe organized skepticism come about through crowdfunding. And once again, that ties back to, I think, disinterestedness of like the research is sort of is forced into a position where they may be undermining their own sort of respect for science to do stuff that will, let's save the cute animals instead of the endangered ugly animal, right? Like, I mean, that sort of stuff gets funding, and it gets funding in brick and mortar universities as well. So how far the crowdfunding model, at least in an experiment, is a complete radical break from traditional university funding is I think still up in the air. I can see why people have hope for this, but I'm very skeptical.
I think that's fair. And part of it is just in general, I like to be kind of optimistic about the idea that research funding can change. The grant process is phenomenally unrewarding. Like it, and I can understand why the researchers who initially got together to fund or to found Experiment did so, because it's like kind of a soul crushing process, and you're using these, like, the interface for Experiment is significantly nicer than almost any application system I've ever used before. The language and stuff is very accessible, and I like the idea of involving the public in a very direct way in determining what research gets funded and what doesn't. However, once you start including the public, the variables kind of like explode in terms of like, yeah, the public is going to want to fund like let's do this project on this cute endangered animal versus this, very ugly frog or something. Like that is a significant problem, and I don't have an answer for that. I think that it is, once we get kind of beyond the kind of trust and accountability and transparency concerns, I think that's probably my biggest concern is who, and most of the, this is mostly the second chapter of my thesis, or like a large chunk of it. The third chapter is a lot more about what I kind of call for shorthand, a lot of the social justice sort of focused issues. So who is able to participate in crowdfunding in this manner, both as a researcher and as a potential donor? And how does that kind of perpetuate or perhaps not perpetuate kind of these existing norms in how research kind of gets funded? And so I'm hoping that gets, I'm hoping actually that I get to do more work on this. When I first set out to write this, I was like, yeah, cool. I think I can like spend a year writing about crowdfunding and then I'll feel very happy with it. I don't think it's a dissertation's worth of work at this point in time, but perhaps I should go back. I think that there is a lot more to be said. And I think that does pose a significant problem.
All right, so I see our darling Fobs has a question, and just a kind of point of organization. The other group's running a little bit behind, so you know we can talk past the hour. We have an hour break before the next workshop starts anyway, so you know we can stay. We can chat about all the things. So I have Fobs and then Alita on deck.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me first of all?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for your talk, and thank you, William, for your comments. They're very helpful. On the last point that you mentioned about who gets to participate in crowdfunding, I think the thing that is kind of in the background that hasn't really been mentioned yet is that there is also a lot of crowdfunding that is quite nefarious. So like on Patreon, for example, you have people like Colin Wright and Bo Weingard and whatever who are doing like basically scientific racism funded by regular people, more or less. And in terms of their being accountable and being entrusted by their donors, the thing that they're being accountable to is to essentially defend the status quo or defend racism or whatever. And I think it's a tough balance to pull apart those I suppose the interests of nefarious groups, especially those with money, from like what is scientifically valid. Like science isn't just gaining a bunch of facts. A lot of research funding is about gaining the facts, but it's about who tells the story and what the story is supposed to convey. And if you have accountability to a bunch of people who mostly don't do the research, who are just interested in the topic, it's quite difficult to have something that's accountable not to what people think that they desire, but like what is, or what they is in, maybe to put it this way, what they ought to desire. And that's a problem that goes back a very long time. Like I work on Plato, that's in Plato, it's before Plato. And there's tons of literature on it, and you can develop that whole thing from basically that period on to now, and like those problems recur. And I think crowdfunding just kind of adds to the problems. Like it solves lots of problems, but it also contributes to them. Yeah, that's all I have to say, I think.
Yeah, so I think part of my like objection to how a lot of crowdfunding kind of writing works, so people who are the few people who are writing about it, is that they see it as this like panacea. They're like, oh, this is it. This is the next big thing. This is as it currently is right now, this is the paradigm shift. And I don't think it is per se, at least not in this current form right now. On the practical point about like funding scientific racism, they do have that internal review process. So I did ask them about how that works, and I don't think you're going to see any like phrenology studies or anything on Experiment. And they don't do like ethics review. So if you're doing research on humans and you have the lab affiliation at your university, and all that's missing is the, $400 you need to do the study, then like you have to go to Experiment and say, hi, I have my ethics review, I just need the money. So because when I first started like diving into this, I was like, can you just fund whatever? Like, do you need any approval? So like you do need that. And I think, can you reiterate the second part of your question? I think there was like a second component that I wanted to respond to, but I was trying to keep that part in my head.
Yeah, fair. So it's more like what exactly is is crowdfunding solving that? Like people have been dealing with this problem for a long time. How is moving crowdfunding online really that different from like finding patrons or whatever in the Renaissance, or wealthy Athenians, and just essentially bending to their will? So how is crowdfunding in today's world going to be different than that?
I can see. So I think you can contribute however much you want to a crowdfunding campaign. Even if I have no money left at the end of the month, but I have $5, and my friend has launched a crowdfunding campaign, and I really want to support them, and I have this $5 burning a hole in my pocket, I can do the make a difference thing and contribute to their crowdfunding campaign with that $5. So I think in some respects it's a little more accessible because you don't need to have large amounts of wealth to make that little bit of difference. But if you don't have stable internet connection at home or at all, or Experiment works with PayPal. So if your country doesn't have access to PayPal, and there are a lot of countries, especially lower income countries, that don't have access to PayPal at all, like you're screwed. And I think that's a huge problem, because that also affects who is able to set up an account and set up a proposal in the first place, and who is able then to contribute. Because even if you are a researcher in a higher income area who you have access to the PayPal account, and you can for all intents and purposes, you've got the internet capacity, whatever, to set up your proposal. If most of your social and personal network is in a country that doesn't have access to PayPal, you're also screwed, because everyone has talked about how you need to have this robust personal and social network to really make this work, especially if you're trying to raise a lot of money. So I want to stay hopeful about the future of crowdfunding. I'm very curious to look into how kind of these more cooperative, kind of anti-capitalist crowdfunding sites function, because I think that could also kind of be a game changer within this sort of game changer movement. But yeah, I don't think you're wrong to see those kinds of problems. Did Alita have a question?
Yes, I do. So I think this is really interesting. I have read a little bit about and written myself a little bit about medical crowdfunding, but not about research crowdfunding. So I would encourage you, even if you're tired of the project, that maybe there's more to keep working on. Something I'm thinking about, I think, connects to some of the structural issues that William was raising, and also probably to the chapter of your thesis that talks about some of the social justice sort of elements of it. And this is sort of thinking about the underlying system for how we want the mechanism of open science to be funded. And the concern with crowdfunding is that it shifts it from a public to a private model. And the concern is that, especially as you have in the post-coronavirus era, more and more universities in the United States and Canada, and even probably more so elsewhere, restricting funding, especially state institutions, and there's less and less funding for research, that crowdfunding becomes this stopgap measure. It becomes this way to fill in the gaps and go directly to the public. But that's still private capitalist funding, even though the public is funding it. And we might, I think a concern about crowdfunding is whether it sort of is this pressure valve that eases the pressure for adequate public funding of research and adequate public, meaning government, taxpayer funding of institutions. And so I think this is a really big structural question that is probably beyond the scope of the project you're engaged in right now. But I would encourage you to think about, or I would be curious if you have thoughts about the sort of reliance on crowdfunding in the long term, that in the short term, it makes science more democratic, but you might worry that in the medium and long term, it entrenches a sort of neoliberal, ultimately undemocratic, unpublicly funded research agenda.
Yeah, so I have thought about this a little bit. I think it is very easy and very certainly agreeable to see crowdfunding as that stopgap measure. you know, and especially because so many people who use crowdfunding for their research are grad students who, like, you know, they don't need like tens of thousands of dollars. They need like a small, probably department grant or something like that would take care of it. The money's just not there at their institution. What I will say is that I'm in Canada, so we don't really have private universities in the same way. So I'm trying to not get too into like the discussion of private universities versus public universities, because it's not something I'm super knowledgeable about. And so, yeah, I do see the concern for crowdfunding as that sort of emergency measure that sort of kind of lifts the pressure ever so slightly, but that doesn't make a difference long term. And, you know, I started this project before the pandemic, and I ended up writing the final draft in the middle of it. So I'm nervous. Like, I don't want to kind of write crowdfunding off as an option. I think that there are ways to kind of make it a more like democratic process, or to make it, you know, even if it's not the funding part that survives the whatever comes next, even if people are like, okay, this is a stopgap measure, this isn't really working, what we really need to do is advocate for better public funding of these projects. I kind of want to see the science communication aspect of it survive, because I think that is really important universally. And I principally work in like applied ethics and bioethics, and my undergrad degree is in philosophy and biology. So I kind of got two very different extremes of the kind of communication and writing skill sort of experience in undergrad. And I think that, you know, if I look at one of the big kind of shortcomings of post-secondary education in the sciences right now, it's that there is very limited opportunity to develop communication skills. And I would like to see more science researchers be better communicators. I think that is actually a really good thing about those crowdfunding platforms. And so I think that's why the lab note thing really bothers me, that there are some projects where people do put in the time and the effort to update their patrons or their donors every week about, you know, what's going on. We hit this roadblock, but this was a success. That's cool. Like, that, I can't imagine how cool that must be if you're someone who's really interested in a particular kind of engineering, or how something works in a certain kind of microbiology. Getting to watch researchers or kind of hear kind of blog updates, dispatches from the field about how that works in real time must be really, really cool. And I would love to see more scientists do that. So that's kind of my like little beacon of hope for crowdfunding, but I do see the structural issues with it not really potentially making a difference long term.
I just want to just quickly add to this, because I think Alita brings up like some really important points, and like in Australia, the funding model's awful. Absolutely. It's probably similar to what's in Canada, where it's very research is applied to the Australian Research Council for funding, and it takes like a year to write up a grant. And recently, over the last couple of years, Australia's has a very conservative government, and they've introduced what they call national interest tests for research, which sounds as ominous as it is basically you have to prove how your research will be of benefit to Australians and Australia. The great thing about crowdfunding is that it sidesteps that. The bad thing about crowdfunding is you're playing to the same public that votes these people in, right? I get the optimism. I get the optimism around. So one of the things with the accountability and transparency thing with the lab notes, right, is we're for that sort of stuff because we're academics and we're researchers and we think that thing's important. I get the feeling that the general public doesn't, and the only thing that matters to the general public is the outcome of the research. How does this well, even not even the outcome, but does this research sound cool? And like, some people will be interested in the outcome, but they're not really interested in the nitty gritty, right? They don't want to know that your data analysis failed because your computer wasn't powerful enough to run the code. You know, people don't, unless you're a researcher who cares about those sorts of things, or why your data analysis was greater than p was greater than 0.05, you know, where you fucked up somewhere. The public doesn't care about p, right? They just care about what the end product is. And so I think we have to be very careful about, when we're talking about these things of like accountability and transparency and trust, what the public actually thinks of those things. Because I'm not sure that the sort of general inclination, and I haven't done any research there, so I'm just really talking into the ether, but that ideas of accountability are different at our perspective than they are from the general public's perspective, right?
Yeah, and so I kind of, like, a tangential sort of perennial interest of mine is scientific literacy, in particular scientific literacy amongst the general public. And maybe it's me projecting and thinking that I think more people should at least have the tools to be scientifically literate and to read about a new development in a certain field in science and say, okay, I don't know the details about that. I don't actually know, maybe I don't know anything about microbiology. And honestly, if you look at my undergrad transcript, I don't know a lot about microbiology, but I can tell you like why it's important. And so I think I don't see the kind of crowdfunding and kind of transparency and updating stuff as existing kind of in a vacuum. I see it hopefully coming to fruition along with this piece about like better scientific literacy. And I kind of hypothesizing that might be something that comes about a little bit during and in the eventual wake of the pandemic, because everyday scientific literacy has become a lot more important, especially with respect to kind of how we parse the like flood of information we receive about like science. I think that we might see some changes there. Like, I personally would like to see some changes in that area. So I don't, that kind of optimism for that doesn't occur on its own, I guess.
Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, thank you. Well, today I learned about Mertonian norms, and I think the interesting one here is disinterestedness. And I think this sort of links up with some of the issues that William brought up about the lack of fit between what the public expects of research and what researchers understand it to be. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor once wrote a paper on irreducibly social goods. And I think first, disinterestedness falls into that category in the sense that, what matters is, the openness of the research rather than the return on the investment. But those two aren't entirely incompatible. While this was going on, I remember, and this will sort of date me as a fossil, back in the early 60s, there were two there were two organizations, one in the Northeast, Bell Labs, and the other in Palo Alto, Xerox PARC. And the thing about them is that they engaged in pure research. They got their funding from the government, they got their funding from their parent companies, and they just had tons and tons and tons of money. And their mission was, do what you want. The idea being that this is an irreducibly social good, because pure research will essentially stumble upon something eventually that will be of scientific benefit, but it will also be of tremendous public benefit as well. In fact, it's my understanding that both Bill Gates and Steve Jobs visited Xerox PARC, were impressed by everything, and then proceeded to adapt, if you want to call it that, or steal their insights for their own products. I think there's got to be, and I'm not sure how to address this, neoliberalism is a thing. And I think that, since the entrenchment of neoliberalism, the idea has taken hold that, if I'm going to lay my money down, I want a clear return on my investment. To the extent that public crowdfunding can do a bit of an end run around that would be great. Although I'm not sure. First of all, I'm not sure that it does, and second of all, it certainly wouldn't, come anywhere near the investment made in these research firms like Bell Labs and Xerox PARC. To say, well, you'll get a return on investment eventually. It might be in 2 years, it might be in 20 years. And this is not how money works these days. And other than some form of social democracy or democratic socialism, I'm at a loss to see how that will happen. So I don't want to be the gloomy guts, but there you go.
I don't know if I have a clearly defined answer. I think that the reason you invest in a crowdfunding campaign, separate from a medical crowdfunding campaign, I guess I'm thinking, and honestly different from an entrepreneurial crowdfunding campaign, I think very specifically when you crowdfund in the research space, experiment kind of what they say in terms of their reward is the production of new science. So it promotes this idea for would-be contributors that if you are interested in this idea, if you think that this is research that should exist, puts and you've got the means to do so, put some money into it. But the other kind of piece that comes with that then is that about 2/3 of, and this is from the woman I spoke to from Experiment, about 2/3 of the donations that are the average campaign receives are from someone's immediate social network. So either they're from if you're a grad student at a university, maybe they're from other grad students, maybe they're from faculty members, they're from your family, your friends. And so just over 1/3 are from the general public. And I think that that's an important component as well. And in the 3rd chapter of my thesis, I end up talking about this a lot because I think there are some issues with how that 2/3 portion comes up, and also some issues with the fact that the remaining 1/3 is a very iffy 1/3. There are a lot of projects that clearly make it to that 66-67% of funding goal. That's probably mostly from family, friends, coworkers. And then that last 30% just doesn't get there because the project doesn't have enough appeal for the general public for whatever reason.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was wondering about that, what the demographics of people who would engage in that would be.
Yeah, the problem with having kind of dug myself into this little hole about crowdfunding for a year is that coming out, I'm like, what parts do people want to hear about the most?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it's important, and I think it sort of is a clear sign of the massive change in the idea of investment in scientific funding, indeed any kind of academic enterprise. They talk about STEM, and I keep thinking, it's the the S and the M don't matter as much as the T and the E. The return on the investment is just not there. And I mean, the irony of it is that so much did come out of Bell Labs and Xerox PARC. Just simply out of the idea, people, throwing money at scientists and say, have fun, and then let us know when you have something that might be useful in a technological sense. That's pretty much gone. And the question I don't know how to answer is, how do you get it back?
Can you imagine if we were all just given here, like have some money, have a nice time with it?
Well, yeah, but I mean, that's exactly what Xerox PARC was like. I mean, Xerox was an extremely profitable company. And yes, they paid their dividends, shareholder value went up, but a lot of their profits were just thrown at the research park, which also had, like NASA, gave them money, the Air Force gave them money, but all with that idea that this is disinterested. We're not going to attach strings to this for two reasons. A, it's an irreducibly social good, and B, eventually things will will come out of it, that are profitable, like the mouse. The guy in Xerox PARC invented the mouse, and it was stolen by, and the graphical user interface, and it was stolen by Bill Gates. So yeah.
Well, awesome. It looks like we have about 40 minutes until the next round. Thank you so much, Rachel, William, everyone who asked
Thank you, everybody. I really
questions.
appreciate the discussion.
That was fantastic.
Wonderful.
And yeah, so if you guys want to pop over to Zoom Room A, they're over there chatting about things. I see that Jonathan is talking about stuff, so I'm sure there's exciting things to be happened over there. Otherwise, there will be a workshop talk starting here in 40 minutes and elsewhere. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for organizing this again.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank
Yeah,
you.
this is great.
I'm so glad that we've had such a good turnout and everything. And, we had awesome submissions from y'all and great commentaries. So I'm excited.
And thanks, Rachel, for your paper. Brilliant. You should definitely continue this stuff. I think
Thank
it's
you.
really
Thank you so much for your comments. I really appreciate them.
All right. See y'all in a
yeah.
Hey. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hey.
Awesome. Cool.
Yeah, nice to meet you. Thanks for organizing this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, no, of course. I'm really stoked to see everybody and meet people and hear what everybody has to say. It's been really awesome so far.
Yeah. Hopefully people show up to this room. But
I mean, the kind of fun thing is it could be the case that a bunch of people are watching on YouTube.
That's
and
true. Yeah.
Then it's just you and I talking, and that's fine.
Glass half full.
Right. Yeah. I mean, worst case, you get to talk through it, and I can just give you all the feedback I can.
Yeah, that's fine too. Yeah, absolutely. That works for me. Is this your first time like organizing an online conference, or have you had experience doing it so far? Or?
I mean, so University of Iowa has it's called the Iowa Lyceum, and it's for pre-college students aged 13 to 18, and we do like a week-long, professors have talks, and it's run by grad students, so we have a bunch of conversations with them. So I did that online over the summer, and I'm currently doing the University of Iowa's graduate conference.
Cool.
But that one's in about a month, so hasn't come up yet.
Awesome. Yeah, I just asked because I haven't had any experience doing this. I was just kind of curious do you have any pro tips for navigating? I would like to do it in the future, some sort of organizing an online conference, but yeah, so yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, it's easier, right, than actually have to find spaces and assign things. The one thing has just been trying to figure out, okay, Zoom rooms and the YouTube live links and getting everything all situated all at once.
Yeah.
But we realized you can't actually be in a Zoom call and host a Zoom call at the same time. Learned that this morning.
Oh. Can't be in a Zoom call and host a Zoom call at the same time. Okay, interesting.
So I tried to start mine with, Jen's going, and
I see. Yeah. Okay, should I start sharing my screen, or?
We can give it a couple minutes. I mean, we'll do a little. This is how it's gonna go. Again, you can take kind of as much time as you want, since it's really workshopping. So we're here to talk through your ideas with you, ask questions, comment. We are all your commentators.
Yeah, it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, I just prepared basically a 10 to 15 minute presentation, and the hope that people will get something out of that and can press me on some issues, or yeah. But yeah, no, looking forward to it, obviously. Okay, so some people are coming in here.
Yeah, we're trickling in.
How's the weather in Iowa right now?
I am actually in Utah I'm driving back to Iowa tomorrow and Monday.
Well, then how's the weather in Utah?
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Because where are you coming from right now?
I'm in California, Southern California, yeah. In Irvine, yeah. So.
Oh, right.
Sunny. Yesterday was quite rainy, but today's actually sunny. Yeah. So West Coast vibes.
Nice. SoCal
represent. Neil, are you also in SoCal, or are you from SoCal, or?
I'm in SoCal. I'm in Covina a little bit up here, but actually just finished a UCI degree not that long ago. So
really?
A graduate? So I was actually listening to YouTube and then heard your comments about the room being empty and people on YouTube, so that I'd pop over here to Zoom.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah. Maybe I shouldn't vocalize everything I'm thinking. Yeah. Was it an undergrad degree or a graduate degree from UCI?
No, that was going back for an MBA. I did my philosophy master's at Cal State LA and undergrad at Cal Poly Pomona in philosophy as well.
Oh, nice. When were you at Cal State LA?
Ooh, that would have been right after the last crash. So like 2009, 2010, I think I graduated from philosophy there.
Okay, yeah, I know a bunch of people from there.
It was fun it was fun being the communist, I guess, in the MBA group. or at least wanting to represent that side of things because it was poorly represented in anything that they're showing.
Yeah, that must have been fun. Well, thanks for coming, Neil. I appreciate it. Yeah, and thanks for hopping over from YouTube to Zoom.
Well, cool. I imagine we can probably get started. So we have Lewis. Yes, Lewis, not Lewis.
Yes, yeah, Lewis.
Lewis. All right, we have Lewis coming from sunny SoCal, sunny, rainy, I imagine warmer weather than the rest of us are experiencing. So gonna talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to comments, questions, general conversation to workshop this paper.
Yeah, I need to share my screen for the PowerPoint, but apparently it's disabled.
There, now you should have
Okay.
all the powers that be.
All the powers. Okay, awesome. Okay. I'm not sure why Iowa came up there. Let's see. Slideshow. Okay. Can everyone see that? Okay. Yeah. All right, let me just move that here. Okay, cool. Thanks to Jennifer and Cassie for organizing this. I really appreciate being a part of it. Since I only have 10 to 15 minutes, I'm just gonna get right to it. So the title of my talk is Making Sense of Susan Stebbing's Common Sense Realism. If you haven't heard of Susan Stebbing before, well, I'm excited to introduce you to her some of her thoughts, her philosophy. If you have heard of Susan Stebbing before, well, then I hope you find something somewhat new in this talk. Okay, so let's just start with some brief biography. So Susan Stebbing, or L.S. Stebbing, the L stands for Lizzie. She never liked the name Lizzie, so she stuck with Susan. Susan Stebbing was born in 1885 and died in 1943. She actually initially studied history at Girton College, which is a constituent of Cambridge, University of Cambridge. And it was one of the two institutions that women could study at during that time. But also, in fact, if you went to Girton College, you couldn't actually get an official degree from Cambridge, so you couldn't become full members of the university because of the sort of opposition to women studying at that time. But nevertheless, Stebbing went there. She studied history. In 1907, when she was 22, she discovered the great British idealist F.H. Bradley's a book, Appearance and Reality, in the library. And it was after reading that book that she decided to make the switch from history to philosophy. Kind of a funny book to be inspired by because it's so obscure and intimidating. It's very, the prose is very Victorian, so not very accessible, but nevertheless, she was inspired by Bradley to switch to philosophy. Sort of after that she moved to London to do an MA in moral sciences, and that's sort of where she met Moore around 1917. And in addition to Moore, but also Russell and Whitehead. And this is supposed to be the alleged year of her conversion to analytic philosophy. Before that, she was working on sort of like French voluntarism and pragmatism. But okay, so she gets hooked to philosophy, and she went on to do sort of a bunch of remarkable things within philosophy. So here's just a laundry list of, it's a non-exhaustive list. She did much more than this, but here are some pretty cool things that she did. So she served as the president of the Aristotelian Society and the Mind Association. Along with Gilbert Ryle and a couple others, she co-founded the journal Analysis, which is still, the best short-form journal for philosophy today. She arguably published analytic philosophy's first textbook. We could talk about that in the Q&A about whether it was that first textbook of analytic philosophy. And she both was a popularizer of both philosophy and logic. She was sort of a public philosopher. She produced a lot of public philosophy, engaged in a lot of public philosophy, and wasn't afraid to sort of engage with the scientists of her day when she found that they were, increasingly muddled in their philosophical ruminations about science. She also played like an essential role in bringing logical positivism to Cambridge. So in 1934, she invited Carnap to speak in London, and it was at that meeting that Carnap met for the first time Russell and Ayer. Okay, so she played an essential role in sort of introducing these two people from different continents, right? She also in 1933, in Bedford College in London, she became Britain's first female professor of philosophy. So this was a huge deal at the time, right? Because again, women were discouraged from pursuing academics. They thought, they were too weak for it, right? So this actually made newspapers at the time. This was a very big event that she became Britain's first female professor of philosophy. Okay, so despite all these, accomplishments and accolades, it's kind of curious that she never really seemed to be properly canonized within analytic philosophy, right? When you think of analytic philosophy, when you think of its great giants, you think of, Moore and Wittgenstein and Russell, right? Frege, but you don't hear about Susan Stebbing. And though my talk today is not going to answer the question why she wasn't properly canonized or not properly appreciated, I think it's just nice to pause and reflect on, why that might be very briefly, right? And so I have this very telling anecdote here that I just want to present. So when Moore was retiring from his chair at Cambridge, he was looking for a replacement, and Stebbing was sort of being considered, but ultimately the chair went to, surprise, surprise, Wittgenstein. But here we have Stebbing reporting with frustration to two close colleagues regarding the replacement. On Thursday, Gilbert Ryle annoyed me by saying, "Of course everyone thinks you're the right person to succeed Moore, except that you are a woman." I don't swear those were his words, but as nearly as I remember. Okay, so I'll leave that there. Very telling anecdote about maybe why Stebbing didn't receive the sort of proper canonization that she ought to have. Okay, but that's not what I'll be focusing on for this talk. Very briefly, I'm interested, and I emphasize very briefly because I don't have much time, two questions that I'll be exploring in this talk. And most of the Stebbing scholarship out there, and there's not much of it, I can count it on one hand how much scholarship there is on there about her, tends to focus on her contributions to logical analysis and logic and so on. I want to sort of explore some potentially unexplored themes in her philosophy. So namely, I want to focus on the role common sense played in Stebbing's metaphysics and how much of Stebbing's common sense worldview was influenced or inspired by Moore. Okay, so let's start with Stebbing's metaphysics. So she had sort of an interesting, maybe complicated relationship to metaphysics. On the one hand, she thought metaphysics was valuable and worth doing, important. But on the other hand, she was very highly critical of sort of one brand of metaphysics, what she called deductive metaphysics, which was, you can think of it as sort of the idealist metaphysics that come to dominate 19th century Britain. So think of, Bradley, think of McTaggart, right? So like Russell and Moore, she was highly critical of this sort of brand of metaphysics. And she even compared the works of such metaphysicians to works of art. That wasn't supposed to be a compliment, that was supposed to be a disparaging remark, right? That these guys weren't really producing, real philosophy. They weren't getting at the truth. They were really coming up with these beautiful, systematic works of art, right? So here's a kind of a juicy quote, although I think there's some juicier ones, but here's a fairly juicy one. So this is her criticizing deductive metaphysics, right? Such a system, the deductive metaphysical system, may have beauty, the beauty of a work of art. Small wonder that great men have spent themselves in the creation of such constructions. In my opinion, metaphysics does not consist in creation, but in investigation, right? So she thinks that the deductive metaphysician is just engaged in creation, like an artist would create works of art, but not in genuine theoretical investigation of how, what the nature of reality is like and so on. Okay, so what exactly was the problem with this deductive approach? 3 points, roughly. So Stebbing didn't like how this ultimacy condition on deductive metaphysics. So deductive metaphysics assumed that reality with a capital R had some sort of ultimate nature, right? This made sort of deductive metaphysics esoteric. It meant that deductive metaphysics had its own distinct subject matter, ultimate reality, and that it uncovered its own distinct realm of facts, ultimacy facts, right? But I think more specifically, it was the method that the deductive metaphysician assumed that Stebbing found so contentious. In sort of Chisholm's terms, right? Think of Chisholm's 1973 lecture where he introduces a distinction between particularism and Methodism. Deductive metaphysics was sort of broadly Methodist in spirit. It meant privileging a priori abstract philosophical principles over common sense. And this was something that Stebbing thought was highly contentious. So how could we do better metaphysics, right? Stebbing clearly had a vision for how to do better metaphysics. So metaphysics, according to her, wasn't about ultimacy. It wasn't about the ultimate nature of reality. It wasn't about getting at ultimacy facts, right? Metaphysics for her aims to show what is the structure of the facts in the world to which reference is made. Meaning basically that metaphysics starts with common sense, and then it sort of, to using some contemporary jargon, metaphysics is about sort of locating the truth makers for what make those common sense facts true. So again, from this, it follows, according to Stebbing, that metaphysics isn't concerned with a distinctive region of fact, right? Ultimacy facts, it's not in the aim of demonstration. It isn't in the business of producing absolute and certain necessary truths. So again, we kind of capture this methodology here, again, drawing on Chisholm's distinction. Stebbing was sort of a particularist, right? She thought that metaphysics should privilege common sense over any abstract philosophical principles, right? Common sense was more certain than any abstract philosophical principles that we could come up with. Okay, so, it's clear that common sense is a central part of her sort of approach to metaphysics. It's playing a big role. It's playing a significant role in her philosophy. So you might think in granting common sense such a central role to her philosophical theorizing, More's influence is clearly coming to the fore here, right? So a question that's interesting here that I want to take up is, how much of a Morean was Stebbing really, or how influenced she was? How much influence did More have on Stebbing? Oh, sorry. Let me just read this quote, which sort of captures her approach to metaphysics. Sorry, I got ahead of myself there. So we must begin with common sense facts, such as I see this candle or this blow on his head killed this man, or her remarks made him angry. It's useless first to define material thing or cause, and then to ask whether the terms so defined are exemplified in the world. Yet this is what the deductive metaphysician does, unless he takes the easier course of defining the terms and then ruling out whatever does not conform to the definitions as mere appearance. Okay, again, so just to repeat, common sense is playing a significant role. How much influence did More really have on Stebbing? Is Stebbing a Morean? So Ayer, for example, characterizes Stebbing as very much a disciple of More, right? I'm interested in the question, is this true, right? Now it's clear that More had some influence on Stebbing. Stebbing met More in 1917 when she presented some work at a meeting of the Aristotelian Society in London, and she was very impressed by, I guess, More's tenacity in the Q&A. More apparently was just grilling her, and she was really impressed by that. And that converged with her conversion to analytic philosophy. And clearly, in this quote here, she acknowledges, More's influence on her thought, right? So she says this: I agree with Professor More in holding that the common sense view of the world is, in certain fundamental features, wholly true. I agree with him further in believing that we all, plain men and philosophers alike, have held this. For example, I hold, and I venture to think that you also hold, that there have been very many other human beings who have had bodies and have lived upon the earth. Again, at this moment, I know that this is a table. I also know that there are trees and rocks. All right, so here's a very explicit mention of More's influence. And notice that a lot of these passages she's mentioned here are passages that are from More's In Defense of Common Sense, his 1925 essay. And really, what you see in Stebbing's work is, if there is an acknowledgement to More, it's an acknowledgement to this particular paper of More's, right? She never cites More's proof of an external world. Maybe she cites some of his earlier stuff, but it's really in defense of common sense that if More was an influence on her, it was that paper of More's that was an influence. But okay, so was Stebbing very much a disciple of More? I don't think so. I think there are numerous points of departure from More and Stebbing, and I think Stebbing took common sense further than More ever did. And I think maybe in some sense, I want to say that Stebbing was more of a Morean than More. So that's, in the remainder of time I have here, I'll try to establish that, or at least establish that her views differed from More in quite substantive and significant ways. Okay, so first point of departure, right, is Stebbing's general dismissal of questions concerning the real definition of things, right? So she didn't like questions like, what is it to be an F, or what is time? What is force? She thought such questions were misleading without sense. And she complains that it's useless to define, material thing or cause or time or external world. Why? Because she sees those questions as sort of belonging to the domain of deductive metaphysics, right? That's what the deductive metaphysician does, is start with these questions, then try to answer them using philosophy. But she sees that the foundation on which deductive metaphysics is built as a grave defect, right? But recall that in Proof of an External World, in Moore's 1939 paper, literally all that most of that paper, like 90% of that paper, is just is more laboring over what it means to be an external thing, right? In other words, he's laboring over this question: what does it mean to be an external thing, an external material thing, right? A mind-independent thing. So it's likely that Stebbing would have thought that Moore was maybe being misled here, that he wasn't, asking the right questions. Okay. Second is, I think, the way in which Stebbing thinks we have knowledge of the external world. So according to her, and she's not always very clear about this, but according to her, we don't necessarily infer the existence of the external world from common sense truisms like here is a hand, right? In the way that Moore attempts to do in his proof. So, right, recall Moore's proof: here is a hand, here's another, boom, there's an external world, right? We've inferred this conclusion from its premises, from common sense premises, right? But for Stebbing, this seems maybe wrong. Rather, for her, there's no problem of justifying an inference to the external world since it's not inferred, she says, okay? So for Stebbing, the problem in the external world isn't one of justification or belief. Rather, it's a problem of analyzing what it is we know when we do know such common sense facts as these. Now, that last bit here, right, that sounds like more of in defense of common sense when he talks about analyzing what we know, analyzing common sense truths. But this part about an inference to the external world not being inferred, that seems very much against what Moore was trying to do with his proof, right? In fact, what she says here sort of is more aligned with some of the things Wittgenstein said in Uncertainty with regards to our hinges, right? Which are things that can't be justified, or that aren't justified nor unjustified, or known or unknown. Okay. So third, I think, is the scope of Stebbing's common sense commitments. So sort of unlike Moore, I think Stebbing was more, unlike Moore, she engaged with a lot of philosophy of science, right? Moore never did any sort of philosophy of science. Stebbing was very much immersed in mathematical logic, in philosophy of science, philosophy of physics. And I think when it came to disputes and debates within those domains, she, when her common sense rubbed up against science, I think she always thought common sense was the victor here. She always thought that maybe science was sort of gone awry if it's rejected common sense truisms, right? So here are maybe two examples. So one is in this lesser known article of hers, 1936 paper, where she's discussing McTaggart's paradox and the physics of time. And she says that the reality of the past and future comes perilously close to nonsense, okay? And then she says that temporal notions like futurity, presentness, and pastness are all mutually irreducible, and that will be, is, now, and was are each unique. They can't be analyzed in terms of each other. That kind of, this kind of suggests that maybe she was sympathetic to some version of the A theory. I mean, from this, it sounds like she's maybe sympathetic to presentism, right? If you think that the sort of metaphysics we get from special relativity is one in which the past and future and the present are all equally real, right? I mean, that's already misleading to say the past, future, and present. But if you think those are all equally real, and if Stebbing seems to be saying that the reality of those things is nonsense, maybe you think that she's rejecting this sort of spatialization notion of time that we get from special relativity. But more explicitly, I think in her book, Philosophy and the Physicist, 1937, the whole book is dedicated basically to taking to task this well-known physicist, Arthur Eddington, who proposed this two-table ontology. And we could talk about maybe that more in the Q&A, but essentially Eddington thought that the lesson we should draw from the atomic theory of matter is that solid objects aren't really solid, right? They're mostly empty space with a bunch of electrons dancing around in them. Stebbing thought that was very misleading, thought that was wrong. Basically, the moral is common sense says tables are solid, in light of in light of whatever the atomic theory of matter says, right? Okay, and then finally is Stebbing's development of the distinction between logical analysis and metaphysical analysis. And we could talk more about that distinction in the Q&A, but essentially just a quick summary of it is logical analysis aims to replace sort of natural language expressions with logically perspicuous counterparts. So think of sort of Russell's theory of descriptions as being, exemplifying logical analysis, whereas metaphysical analysis is distinct from this. It's supposed to uncover sort of the basic facts that make our various beliefs true. Okay, so this is a distinction that Stebbing developed, and true, it's one that Stebbing admits being indebted to Moore and having developed, right? She says she learned the importance of the metaphysical analysis from Moore. But I think this is more of a polite acknowledgement on Stebbing's part, because Moore never really made the distinction between these two kinds of analyses explicit in his writings, nor did he ever come out and say and identify such analysis as metaphysical. I think Stebbing really developed the distinction and sort of made it her own, and even publicly defended the distinction in the face of various positivists who thought this was a distinction really without a difference. So again, I think maybe you can find something like this distinction in Moore, but Stebbing really sort of takes it further and makes it her own. Okay, and just to wrap up then, compared to Moore, I think, who we think of, the philosopher of common sense in the analytic tradition, I think compared to Moore, Stebbing really wasn't as shy about her common sense commitments as Moore. Her sort of common sense commitments ran the gamut, right? From ordinary objects to temporal ontology to methodological principles. And she even pitted those commitments up against the sort of, as I say here, the unhinged philosophical ruminations of contemporary science, which is something Moore never attempted nor shown much interest in. In other words, all this is just to say that I think Stebbing deserves a place not only in the history of analytic philosophy as one of its great giants, one of its great founders alongside Frege, Russell, and Wittgenstein and more, but also a place sort of in the common sense tradition as a fierce proponent of common sense philosophy. And I think I'm about out of time, so I'm going to end it there. Thank you. Okay. Whew.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Water.
All right, so if we want to do hand raising, or you can type in the chat any questions you have, either directly to me or to everyone.
Yeah, I know I just ran through like a ton of material, so the most basic questions are welcome. Any sort of clarification, happy to elaborate on. Yeah.
I guess based on my interest, and I saw Carl also tweeted about this, but the response to McTaggart sounds interesting, because in some capacity, she does sound like a presentist, but I don't know, appealing to common sense in the presentism eternalism debate against, I mean, obviously McTaggart's wrong, but trying to sort out which one is more common sense. Also seems like a really strange, difficult way forward. So I guess if you could say a little bit more about her response or any of her field time stuff.
Yeah, it's hard to say she even really had a philosophy of time. They're really just, those quotes are just, I could produce more quotes, but she really only talks about her fill time views in that one paper, and it's sort of bits and pieces in that chapter. I'm unaware of her. I'm not aware of her extrapolating any further in other articles of hers. But yeah, it's hard to say whether she was actually like a presentist or something like that, right? I think we get hints of that in those quotations, but yeah. Maybe it's too strong to say she was a presentist. I think at least she had what I seem to be gathering from her work, her fill time work, fill science work, is that I think she at least had this view maybe that, look, if science is this revisionary, if it has these sort of revisionary implications to the effect of saying that tables aren't solid, maybe there's something that's gone awry with the science or our philosophical interpretations of the science, right? maybe in some senses, we're sneaking in too much philosophy or something when we're doing the science. We're drawing philosophical implications from the science where we shouldn't be or something like that. So maybe that doesn't commit her to at least within temporal ontology, a specific temporal position within temporal ontology, but maybe more suggests that, look, we shouldn't be so quick to accept whatever these physicists are telling us. Because I think it's important to keep in mind here that even the physics at the time was really, James Jean, Arthur Edgington, and others, they were kind of idealists in some way. Like there was a lot of idealism in that people were reading into contemporary physics at the time. So I think she was sort of fighting that a little bit. Okay, but that didn't really answer your question because I'm not sure I have a good answer to that question. Yeah, thank you though. Yeah, something I should definitely think more about. Yeah, and her philosophy of science stuff is still stuff that I'm trying to sort through, right? Like this book, that still lots to sort through. So yeah, it's something I'm still working through. But yeah, more food for thought, I suppose. Yeah, thank you. Any other questions, comments, or complaints? I'm happy to take complaints.
So I suppose part of this too is, this is your project. So where do you see this going? Like, are there specific areas that you're still trying to really wrestle with, directions to go, pieces that aren't making sense?
Yeah, there's plenty not making sense. Yeah, I mean, so this talk is based on like a 30-page paper a draft that I've written, still sort of in drafty form. I guess I want to sort of just be able to eventually go into more detail about how exactly she differed from Moore. Really trying to paint like a picture that, of course she was inspired or influenced by Moore, but that she really was doing something different, that she really had developed her own sort of, I think, distinct views about common sense. Yeah, so I think that's something that still needs to be worked out on my end. I mean, I gave, some, examples of that, but I think they can go further. They can be pushed further. Yeah, I guess that's what the task right now. Yeah. Yeah. I see we've got, I think, a question though, which is, from Aaron.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So this is probably, I guess this is a useful space for this because you're still trying to work a lot of stuff out. This is not my domain of expertise at all. So this is a very sort of basic level question, but I think listening to this talk, something that I was trying to understand more was what is the actual thing of value that you're trying to sort of reclaim or give more emphasis to within her version of this particular idea. I see the value, of course, in talking more about how she was going through these similar discussions as more famous people, but not being taken as seriously. But are there sort of specific points within her epistemology that you feel like are still valuable or that you're trying to reclaim in that kind of way?
Yeah, I mean, I think her work on like metaphysical analysis sort of anticipated some of the stuff we see in contemporary metaphysics. When we talk about, Sider talks about the structure of reality or these grounding projects, right? I mean, essentially, she just has this view where, you can think about sort of, you might think certain ground theoretic projects, right? They sort of take common sense seriously. They take certain facts like here is a hand or there are tables is true. And the whole point is, the deep, juicy question to ask is, well, not what exists, because we know that from common sense or something like this, but what grounds these common sense truisms. And Stebbing sort of, I think, would have been very sympathetic to that picture. Right? I mean, she's sort of essentially saying the same thing. She's saying, look, metaphysics and philosophy in general starts with these common sense truisms we don't need to question them, right? And she says in multiple places, common sense needs no defense. Really, the task of metaphysics is to determine, again, I'm using some contemporary jargon, but what makes those truisms true, right? What sort of the truth makers are of those claims. So yeah, so I think, I mean, connecting this back to contemporary stuff, yeah, I think in many ways she's very connected to contemporary discussions about metaphysics. Certainly, yeah. Does that help?
Yeah.
Question to some, yeah.
Yeah, if I could ask a follow-up question, then
Yeah, absolutely.
That makes sense. Interesting. Do you have concerns about criticisms coming from a psychology angle that emphasize sort of empirical evidence undercutting the existence of a common sense in this kind of way?
Yeah, sure. I think, well, maybe you can say a little bit more about that, actually, before I answer that. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think there are probably a couple of different ways that an attacks could be raised there, either in terms of undercutting the idea that an individual has anything like a reliable kind of common sense rather than an assortment of heuristics that are good in some environments and fall apart in other ones, or also concerns about, you know, how much are we looking at cross-cultural common sense versus common sense in a very narrowly researched and studied group of individuals. So those are just some ways that I could imagine that people could continue to raise problems with something like that idea.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, I think that's a good question. I think it's a good question just whether, I mean, I think a lot of people maybe are, especially these days, are, you know, find the appeals to common sense sort of suspicious, right? I mean, in an age of sort of fallibilism and implicit bias, maybe common sense seems kind of, I don't know, parochial or sort of outmoded or something like that. But I guess, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to common sense philosophy. I think it's important though to draw a distinction between sort of, you know, I don't know, local common sense and maybe sort of common sense is hardcore, right? So certainly common sense, certain things that we call common sense have shifted over time, you know, from culture, from different cultures, different historical epochs, right? Like, we have the you know, maybe it was common sense in the Iliadic time to think that the sun revolved around the earth or orbited the earth, right? But we know that's now false, right? Because we replaced a geocentric theory of time with the heliocentric theory of time. But there seems to be another class of propositions that we identify as common sense, and I think they're closer to the sort of pieces of common sense that Moore is interested in, and I think in effect Stebbing. These are things that don't seem as they seem less capable of being revised across time. So I'm thinking of things like things move, or, you know, there are material objects, right? I guess it's when we start thinking about maybe this other class of common sense propositions, this hardcore class, it becomes harder and harder, at least for me, to see how exactly how exactly that could I don't know, be infected by, you know, human bias or something like that, right? Not saying it's impossible, but just it gets harder and harder for me to see how you know, how this proposition, things move, or that there is motion, how that somehow could change from over time or something like that, right? But again, I don't think this is necessarily a satisfying answer to what you're saying, and it still needs to be worked out. I think people who are sympathetic to common sense is something they need to still work out. But yeah, I mean, fair enough, point taken. Like, yeah, there might be problems. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I think Janet.
Yeah, thanks for this. And so I'm going to ask a question that I think is less about metaphysics and more about the sociology of our field. And so maybe you've got part of an answer to it and maybe not, but given that Stebbings was working in a space where, as you you know, pointed out to us, she was aware that there was a cost to being a woman. I'm wondering whether there's a way in which how her ideas are connected to sort of the broader philosophical discussion, or what we might call the canon that we've built around analytic philosophy. whether there's places that pop out where either she had the thing happen that happens to every woman who's ever been at a committee meeting, where they share an idea and it is met with silence until 10 minutes later when the same idea emerges from the mouth of a man, and all of a sudden it's a brilliant idea and it's his, not hers.
Right.
Or sort of the alternate phenomenon, which is a woman shares an idea and a man looks at it and says, madam, you now are my intellectual enemy and I will devote the rest of my days to showing your idea is stupid. So, either from sort of what she may have left behind in terms of letters, commentary, whatever, or places where what you know of Stebbings connects, or at least seems to connect to ways in which we've constructed the canon of analytic philosophy. How much of this was she dealing with?
What was the last part you said?
How much of either or both of these phenomena do you think she was dealing with?
Gosh, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I don't think I have a good answer to that. There's one great book out on Stebbing. It's the only book actually devoted to her thought by this author, Siobhan Chapman. It's called The Language of Common Sense. So I was gonna say, I might recommend you that book to get, she does a great job. I mean, really thorough job of, going into the biographical detail of Stebbing's life and maybe some of her interpersonal relationships and stuff like that. So that's probably the most illuminating source for that. I'm not sure how much I can speak to that. I mean, I think it's really fascinating. I think, yeah, she obviously was certainly aware of this. She was doing a lot of public philosophy. She was very in tune to, she was very in tune to trying to change, I think, the discipline to make philosophy more accessible to people, to show, to demonstrate its relevance to current thought, right? I mean, so she has books like Thinking to Some Purpose, which is an attempt to do public philosophy. Even her, the first analytic textbooks that she produced, Introduction to Modern Logic, which sounds like a boring logic book, but in fact, it's much more than that. She really tries to, because this was a book designed for students, right? She tries very hard to connect, issues and logic which seem, cold and abstract and divorced from reality. She really makes an attempt to sort of connect them to, the politics of the time. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I have a good answer to that. I mean, obviously that quote is really telling about the Ayer quote about, her not getting the chair because she was a woman, which is, just awful. And I can't imagine the other, the conditions she was working with. She also suffered from Meniere's disease, which is this, it makes you nauseous, dizzy. So not only was she, fighting, trying to be a woman in like this man's discipline, but she was also just like, she suffered from like disability, right? So she tons of stuff against her. She was, I think though, she was fierce. Like she was like, if you read this book, like she really destroys these two male physicists. Like she really takes them to task. And she did have a reputation, and maybe that was more common amongst, I don't know, British folk in that day or something. She had a really reputation for being ferocious. Maybe she was, she had to be in order to prove herself in the way that you were, the way that you mentioned, right? Because maybe people didn't take her seriously enough because of her gender or something like that. But yeah, all this to say, I think that's a great question. I just don't have a good answer to that. I don't know enough about that aspect of her life or philosophy, but certainly like worth taking a deeper dive into. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. I don't know. That definitely doesn't address what you were after, but yeah. Check out that book by Siobhan Chapman though. It's really good. Yeah. The Language of Common Sense, I believe it's called. Maybe you'll find some answers there. Yeah. Better answers. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Louis. Thank you so much for the talk. There was a quote in there that I was wondering if you could expand your interpretation on. I'm sorry if this is really basic, but
no.
It was said that metaphysics does not consist in creation, but in investigation. I was wondering if I could get a little bit more clarity on what that really means.
Yeah, absolutely. I also found myself in that position many times with that quote, because she's trying to say that deductive metaphysics is not a genuine investigation into the world. It's it's more like art or something like that. I think what she means though is that on her way of doing metaphysics, what does she say? Metaphysics in some sense leaves things untouched. Like it doesn't uncover any more new facts, meaning that we can't really, metaphysics in some sense doesn't really have a subject matter, right? Like maybe its subject matter is like how the empirical facts that we discover and know are connected, right? The structure of those empirical facts, how those empirical facts are all connected. That's sort of what metaphysics is up to for her. Whereas the deductive metaphysician, I think really does believe that metaphysics has a legitimate subject matter that goes beyond just the empirical world, right? It investigates this ultimacy, this ultimate nature of reality or something like that. So when I think she says, in my opinion, metaphysics is not consistent creation, but investigation, I think she just means like, I think she means just literally like metaphysics just, we're investigating the empirical structure of the world. The empirical structure of the world isn't created, it's already there. Maybe metaphysics is helping us impose a structure on that, but we're not like creating anything. We're not creating new metaphysical principles or new subject matters for metaphysics to investigate. It's all sort of already there, right? That's as like best as I can understand her. In that 30-page paper, I have like a couple of paragraphs trying to unpack that a little bit more, and I think that's sort of just echoed that a little bit. I might say something else there, but I forget. But yeah, I think that's a great question because it is, and maybe that was just a bit of rhetorical flourish too, right? Like maybe she's just trying to be, she's a little contentious or something like that, right? Yeah, great question, great question. I don't know, does that help a little bit? Okay, good. Okay. Any other questions?
I guess I could ask a secondary follow-up question. So you mentioned that she's trying to make philosophy a little bit more accessible in the sense of like kind of focusing on what's already out there and kind of navigating that. I kind of see it kind of like public philosophy in a way, where like, public philosophy is very accessible and that's awesome, to build our field. But do you think there's anything lost in the levels of accessibility? We have this discussion a lot in philosophy where like, the more advanced you get, the more terminological you get, and like the less there seems to be something lost. Do you think that there's anything lost in trying to make metaphysics more accessible in that way?
Oh, that's also a good question. I mean, also if people have other opinions on, because this is I think many people here probably have opinions on this as well, so feel free to chime in. Yeah, I mean, I guess something's lost in a certain respect, right? Like you can't pack in all the detail you would in a graduate seminar when you're trying to do public philosophy or trying to introduce the public to this esoteric field, metaphysics. So yeah, there's a sense in which something is lost. But I think ultimately, that's, I think, okay, right? I mean, as long as you're able to, as long as you're able to sort of give them like there are certain tools we get from philosophy or from metaphysics, right? Certain distinctions. Like as long as they're able to get that, I think, from your presentation of, in this case, metaphysics, right? Even if it means some sacrificing some detail, that seems totally worthwhile, right? I mean, yeah. I mean, does that make sense? Does anyone else? Please interrupt if you have any other thoughts. That's a good question. But yeah, I don't know. Does that make sense? sort of.
Yeah, definitely.
What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, my thoughts
Yeah.
on public philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, I think. Yeah.
I think it's awesome that we're, making accessibility. Like, I know I got into philosophy because of some public works, like, the Philosophy and series. I read a Philosophy and Divergent, and I was like, oh, this is so cool.
Yeah.
But like, as you get further into the field, I'm like learning metaphysics and like four-dimensionalism and all these really abstract ideas. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, like if you tried to explain this to like a layperson, or not a layperson, like a non-philosopher, it'd be really difficult. And like, I wonder what kind of like, what's the value in, I don't know if like, I'm also, I realize this is a really hard question, and I'm also like kind of stumped here because like, it's like there's something lost, but there's also so much importance in getting the ideas out. And sorry.
Yeah, and just communicating. I think trying to just convey, the power of an idea, right? I mean, you're gonna sacrifice some detail. Maybe it's not totally accurate, but it gets people, I think, thinking. It gets people, to think in a creative or imaginative way, I think, which is really important. But now I'm just starting to talk about my own like philosophy of public philosophy views. But yeah, I think that's a good question. Yeah, if anyone else have any thoughts on that, I'd open that up just as an informal conversation. Yeah.
Do you want to repeat the question just for newcomers?
Oh yeah, is it Kylie? Do you want to?
But it's okay. What's the value in opening up accessibility to wider audiences and potentially losing? If there is something that's being lost in public philosophy, because Stebbing is trying to make metaphysics more accessible. If that's correct, Louis, that's what I took, and kind of like what if that's what the value is in that, or maybe not. That's not the question. I apologize. I'm just rambling.
No, it's good. I should add really quick that she was less interested in making metaphysics more accessible. I think it was more logic and critical thinking. So it's like there's a period towards the end of her life where I guess she was worried about fascism because World War II was, occurring. But she sort of seemed to depart from her, more academic work. She stopped sort of engaging in those disputes and really started to just become a public philosopher, tried to do public philosophy. And the emphasis was on logic and critical thinking. She really thought that that's what I think the most valuable thing philosophy could offer was critical thinking. So maybe less about metaphysics, but it's still, the point is the same, right? Like, how can we introduce the public? Is there anything to introduce to the public that they can take from these sort of esoteric disciplines that we engage in, like four-dimensionalism or whatever? Yeah.
I could jump in on this a little bit. Yeah. As someone who does public philosophy in podcasting form, I have found, while it is valuable for me at least to focus on ethics, which is my focus, which is in my opinion, the easiest of the philosophies to hook people into, generally speaking, and to focus on like critical thinking kinds of questions, but that being, I think, a valuable source of public philosophy ultimately ends up involving roping in all of the other fields of philosophy, because to be a good ethicist, you need metaethics, which means metaphysics, you need philosophy of mind and such. So it all ends up coming in. And I think, my experiences as an educator have been, find ways, do what you need to do in order to hook people into something. But once you've hooked them into it, try to help them sort of increase their level, rather than sort of, there's a way you could do like public philosophy where it was always like just the easiest kinds of accessible issues. But I think there is something valuable in my experience, in taking non-philosophers and helping them sort of build themselves up to be able to challenge themselves with a bit of metaphysics.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And then eventually, I guess you direct them to PhD programs and tell them to do a PhD in philosophy or something.
I don't think we should do horrible things to them. I was just helping them try to understand a little bit of philosophy a little better.
Yeah. Just where is the line that's being drawn here? How deep are the distinctions they have to know? Yeah. No, yeah, that's good advice. A good take. A solid take, I think. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Is that sorry? I got here late, so this is
No worries, yeah.
maybe something you already covered, but I was just interested to hear a little more. So Stebbing, it sounded like Stebbing was like quite optimistic about maybe the political efficacy of critical thinking, right? Like that it's actually going to like, you know, help defeat fascism in some way. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe that's an over-exaggeration. Yeah, I'm not sure she would put things that way, but I think, you know, she was really concerned with muddled thinking, right? I mean, the reason she engages with some of these contemporary physicists and scientists, because she thinks that they were sort of, you know, they were speculating in a sort of unanchored way about, you know, the philosophy they found in their physics. So she thought that by just getting more clear-headed, you know, about these issues, that people would just think more clearly. Maybe by thinking more clearly, people would end up making the better decisions, right? More ethically sound decisions, maybe. Yeah, so something like that, I think. I mean, also there was a lot of optimism in the air about the power of logic at this time, right? I mean, we have Russell's definite descriptions and the toolkit that he provides us with that, right? So there's a lot of optimism about sort of like, oh, we get a chance now to really, you know, get clear on our these assertions we make in natural language, right? We have a more perspicuous language we can turn to, this formal language of the first order, you know, predicate calculus or something. Yeah, so there's optimism, I think, in general about the power of philosophy and sort of clearing up muddled thinking or something like this. Yeah, but yeah, go ahead. Sorry, you think you had probably you were continuing your thought there.
Oh, it's a sort of refreshing optimism as someone who, I mean, I find public philosophy great, and I think it's super valuable, but I guess I think of its value as like more akin to the value of something like literature, which is that like it enables people to, or it sort of enriches people's lives, and they think about things in sort of new ways. But I mean, I don't know exactly what I find myself very sort of pessimistic about the like political, like I think the tools of philosophy and like critical thinking are largely just politically neutral, right? It's just gonna, you know, it's really good at connecting premises to conclusions, but which premises you choose is like gonna really condition where you end up, right? And you know, like we see this, right? There are lots of sort of fascists who are quote unquote very well educated, and
yeah, Ben Shapiro,
right? Yeah. So anyway, I was just sort of struck by that, not as an objection, but just like that was a sort of optimism that was less familiar to me than my own sort of deep pessimism.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly easy to feel pessimistic, right? I mean, sometimes there are days where I'm just like, God, I'm not doing anything to help the cause here, right? Like, but yeah, I think it's easy to feel that pessimism. But yeah, I mean, it's great these days to see more philosophers doing public philosophy and you know, being sort of rewarded for it, right? I mean, hopefully the tenure system can change, and that there's a better incentive now to, you know, you can get tenure if you actually, you know, not only just published esoteric research articles, but also you've done some public philosophy. So hopefully we can incentive, you know, can change with the institutionally as well, or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. But no, I mean, yeah, it is refreshing optimism. You can fight fascism with critical thinking. I mean, Woody Guthrie thought he could fight it with his guitar, right? So I mean, so.
I mean, I probably he did a better job than I don't know. I feel anyway. Yeah. But yeah, Jessica has a hand.
Oh, yeah.
So maybe move.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation, Louis. I've learned a lot from it, so I really appreciate it. I'm just wondering how philosophy teachers, educators, professors could introduce Susan Stebbing's work into their teaching beyond just putting her work like next to more on the reading list.
Yeah, I mean, she should. I mean, I know some people have incorporated. So I mean, she obviously, you know, if you're taking a history of analytical philosophy class, she obviously, you know, deserves to be read alongside, you know, on denoting and proof of an external world. I mean, so the article I think that belongs there is the method of analysis and metaphysics. I think that's like her classic seminal paper. Not necessarily an easy read, but a lot of that stuff wasn't really easy to read at that time. I mean, have you read Moore? It's awful. Moore, I mean, I love Moore, but Jesus, I mean, he's impossible to read. He's he's awful to read. And he always just stuffs in, his philosophical nuggets right at the end of the papers, right? It's the last page or something. But yeah, so in terms of syllabi and stuff, yeah, she absolutely deserves to be, that paper, I think, really deserves to be on there with on denoting and, proof of an external world and defense of common sense. Yeah. But also, yeah, I think, again, the method of analysis and metaphysics also could be, people read Quine, for example, when they do teach contemporary metaphysics on what there is, right? That's one that's always assigned, but maybe Stebbing should also be assigned as well, in addition to Quine, right? Again, because I think she anticipated a lot of ideas that we find in contemporary metaphysics. When you read that paper, you certainly aren't thinking, wow, this is really foreign. You're thinking, oh, geez, like this sounds a lot like stuff that contemporary metaphysicians are up to, right? So those are just two ways in which she should be incorporated, definitely. I know that in those very, very short introductions that Oxford puts out, Michael Beanie, who's a Frege scholar of history of analytic philosophy, and one of the scholars I mentioned that I can count on my hand, who's actually done work on Stebbing. He came out with a history of analytic philosophy, a very short introduction from Oxford, and he actually admirably includes Stebbing as, like, he says explicitly and devotes a chapter to her work, saying like she is one of the great founders of analytic philosophy alongside Russell and Frege and Wittgenstein and Moore. So I was really happy to see that. I thought that was really cool. So I think it's just a matter right now of getting more people to read Stebbing and to sort of circulate her work, right? Because people in analytic philosophy don't even know who she is, and that's a shame, right? She was an incredible person. So yeah, I just went off on a tangent, again, another tangent digression. I just get caught up in these little things, but yeah, that's one way of incorporating her in the syllabi, I guess. Yeah. So go read that paper. It's a great paper. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. I think that brings us right to the hour. Thank you so much, Lewis, for the presentation and showing us the light that is Susan Stebbing's common sense realism. Yeah. So thank you all for coming to the workshop edition of the Cogtweeto, whatever it's called. And we have a 2-hour break, and then we'll all come back to Zoom room A, is where M will be presenting their talk on Mary Shepard. So I will see you all shortly.
Awesome. Thanks, Cassie. Thanks for organizing, and Jessica as well. And thanks everyone for coming today. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you. Bye.